Hello, and welcome to Tale Doc. My son and I have always had a close relationship. While he was still in high school, I immersed myself in whatever he was involved in, whether it be football or wrestling. But aside from that, we also played golf and both held a love for hunting, especially archery hunting, that continues to this very day. I can say in all honesty that my son is my best friend. Once he finished high school and the wrestling and football were behind us, we got involved in metal detecting as well, especially during the fall and early spring when it was cooler. It was a great hobby to fill the time before hunting season came in. We live in an area that is rich in history, though a lot of the history can't be uncovered with a metal detector. Northeastern Oklahoma is immersed in Indian history, and most Indian artifacts fall into the category of arrowheads, beads, bones, etc., which are not metallic. On many excursions, we found old coins, and in fact, my son found a buffalo nickel from the late 1800s in the creek bed that runs along our property, as well as 2 pieces of a gold nugget watch band, which kept us interested and always searching for more. It's worth mentioning that we also live in close proximity to a large Amish community, and that's where this story takes a turn. I've never thought of the Amish as having anything otherworldly involved with their belief system. However, this particular event leads one to wonder. My son and I, bored with the usual grind of detecting along the creek systems that snake their way along the adjoining properties, decided to go road dogging, a term that my son used, where you just drive the back roads looking for an interesting place to explore. I was fairly familiar with the surrounding countryside, but nowhere near as affluent as my son, so I drove and he navigated, and we took off one morning looking for a new spot to do some detecting. It's worth noting that my son's best friend comes from a family that is formerly Amish. However, they defected years ago. His last name is Yoder, which is very common in the Amish world. I asked my son how he knew so much about this area, and he shared with me that he and his buddy used to road dog out in this region regularly, traversing the roads and drinking beer to steer clear of the local police. If you're from the country, then you know this is normal practice for country kids. I knew this went on, and to be honest, I didn't mind. At least they weren't hitting bars and clubs, looking for fights and trouble. Anyway, we drove through the barren countryside, talking like any father and son would do. We came to a crossroad, and my son motioned for me to take a left. I was far outside my knowledge of these surroundings, so I asked, "Where are you taking us?" He said, "It's just a little ways up." And as we eased our way along this eerie old dirt road, I looked out both sides of the truck. There was nothing visible except for open fields with cattle, bordered by tree lines along the fences and the creek fingers, and an occasional farmhouse or barn in the distance. It was completely void of human presence for the most part. I saw what looked like a bridge ahead in the distance, and as we creeped along, I said, "What is this?" He looked over at me with a slight grin and said, "Dad, Welcome to Crybaby Bridge. I started chuckling, as I had heard of this infamous bridge before, but had never seen it. Now I know, every culture has a version of the Crybaby Bridge. You know the stories, where if you sit quietly at night, you can often hear the sound of a woman or a baby crying. I'm not the kind of person that's easily swayed by folklore, but I have to tell you that this particular bridge would lead one to believe in the paranormal. It fits all the descriptions for being creepy. It's an old metal bridge, reminiscent of a Stephen King novel, with wood planks to drive across and just an eerie presence about it. We pulled up on the right, just shy of the bridge, and I have to admit I was really excited at the thought of metal detecting around this bridge. I had no idea of the history, but it looked as though it had been there for ages. My son gave me a wink and said, "Pretty cool, huh?" He said, "I told you this would be out of the ordinary." I said, "I don't even want to know how you found out about this place." He just laughed and said, "I found out from Nick." That's the formerly Amish kid I was talking about. We excitedly drug our metal detectors out of the truck and made our way down the grass slope to the creek edge. There wasn't an abundance of water flowing under the bridge, but you could see from the water lines that there were times that the water level was quite high. There was a vast combination of both large river rocks and a gravel beach area on both sides. Of course, my eyes were on the lookout for any arrowheads or signs of Indian artifacts. We turned on our detectors and started scanning the area. We got the usual hits for pop tops, which are soda can pull tabs, along with iron readings, which could be anything. We also found a few coins, though none of them were old enough to get overly excited about. Eventually, however, I got a hit on my detector that gave a high signal, indicating that it could potentially be silver. I called out to my son, who was on the other side of the bridge. He came over to me and I showed him the reading that I was getting. I began to dig, going slowly so as not to damage whatever was in the ground. I pulled a large plug out of the ground and began to pull dirt away. I could tell that it was metallic, and I smiled as I brushed away the debris. Upon closer look, it appeared to be a small mirror. We made our way to the creek edge and sloshed the object in one of the small pools of water to wash away all the dirt and mud. The object I had found turned out to be a small mirror, approximately 3 inches by 3 inches, with a small decorative handle, and a scene inscribed on the backside resembling a tree with a cabin and 2 men sitting with a dog. A gun and a satchel were hanging on a tree in close proximity. I was elated at the sight of it. What an amazing piece. The detail on this piece was extraordinary. We bloviated for several minutes over the piece, and eventually we loaded up and headed back to our home. Once we got home and I cleaned the piece up, I was impressed with the detail and precision of this piece. I did some research, and I found that the piece originally came with a matching hairbrush. It was made by an artist that specializes in Amish design. The piece appears to have been made from possibly copper or tin with silver plating. It was tarnished, of course, from being embedded in mud, but surprisingly cleaned up well. The glass surface that acts as the reflective portion of the mirror is round and slightly convex in shape. It sits into the detail and ornate handle and looks as though it's pressed in, much like a stone in a wedding ring. There's visible spider webbing from the coating behind the glass, resembling the look of a bloodshot eye, which gives it an eerie Gothic look and adds to the patina of the piece. After I clean the piece, I put it into an ornate box that I keep in my closet with many of the other artifacts that I've found over the years. You don't get into this box of collections unless you meet certain criteria. You have to be made of precious metal, like silver or gold, or you must be pre-1900. And lastly, if you are ornately decorated or hold some specific detail that sets you apart from the other pieces, you'll have a spot in this box as well. This is where the story starts to get interesting. I started to notice strange events surrounding this piece. Mainly that it had a tendency to move itself to other locations. I have placed this particular piece in a small velvet bag inside the box many times, only to find it missing shortly thereafter. It would eventually show up again in a drawer downstairs or a cabinet in the downstairs bathroom. I've even found it in my shop in an obscure location with some of my tools. It was as if the piece was playing hide and seek. Each time, I would place it in the bag and into my curio box in the closet, only to find it missing again within days. There was one instance, however, when I found the mirror in one of its strange new locations that will forever be etched into my mind. I was at home alone and was doing my usual chores before my wife arrived home from work. I went into my shop to retrieve some tools, and upon opening one of the drawers in my cabinet, I saw the mirror sitting in its new location, face down amongst the other tools and wrenches. You must understand that it is only my wife and I who live here now. Our kids are grown and have their own lives. My wife is creeped out by the mirror and doesn't want it around her at all. She never goes into the spare room where I keep my things. I stood there a moment, scarcely believing what I was seeing. I'm not one to immediately rush into any notion concerning the paranormal. I try to find rational answers for any given situation. I retrieved the mirror from the drawer and said aloud, "All right, this is getting a little weird. I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to get to the bottom of this once and for all." I held the mirror up in front of me, looking it over, still in amazement of the beautiful ornate carving and design of this piece. The sun was out and shining through the doors of my shop. I was standing with my back to the doors and looking into the reflection of the mirror at the driveway and the trees blowing gently in the summer breeze. I turned my gaze momentarily to look at the clock, expecting my wife shortly, and then back at the mirror. What I saw sent a chill up my spine. There was a girl standing in the driveway. She looked to be about 8 to 10 years old, and she was dressed in typical Amish attire. She was very pale, and her dress was dirty. She was holding a small bouquet of wilted wildflowers. She was staring at me intently. My hand was shaking. She slowly moved one hand up to her face, and with her index finger she covered her mouth as if to say, I let out a muffled, "Oh, God," and I lowered the mirror to my side, almost dropping it. I stood frozen in fear, afraid to turn around. When I finally found the courage to look behind me, there was nothing. I immediately set my mind on finding a way to lock this wicked artifact away from the world in some way that would ensure it could not escape. I've heard stories about people who had artifacts that held some sort of spiritual attachment, but I'd always written it off as superstition. There was an old steel ammo can above me to my left, and had a lockable latch on it. I grabbed it along with an old lock that I alone had a key for. I wrapped the mirror in an old dirty shop rag lying on the workbench, no longer concerned about keeping it in pristine condition. This piece was evil. No doubt, whoever tossed this thing off of Crybaby Bridge had experienced something similar, maybe even worse. I laid the piece in the ammo can and installed the lock, checking it to make sure it was closed. I then hid the ammo can in a dark, out-of-the-way place in my loafing shed where I store my tractor. No one saw me do this, so I knew that if the piece came up missing again, it would galvanize me in the fact that this is not some sick prank, but something beyond my understanding. Several months went by, and I must admit that this strange event stuck with me, creeping into my thoughts often. I wanted, on many occasions, to pull the box from its hiding place to check and make sure that piece was still there. But I couldn't make myself do it. Late that winter, I was in need of bringing some firewood up to the house. It was a gray, cold, overcast day. The kind of day when you would rather stay inside next to the fire. But I knew that it wouldn't be long until we were out of wood, so I walked my way through the snow and down to the loafing shed to start the tractor. When I pulled the doors to the shed open, I, for the first time in a while, thought of the locked ammo box that was hiding in its dark place. Although I wished I hadn't, I could not help myself today. Out of curiosity, I pulled my keys from my coat pocket, my hands shaking a bit, and I fumbled until I found the key for the lock on the ammo box. I pulled the box from its hiding place, and I sat it on the fender of the tractor. I stood there for a moment wondering if this was something I should do, but in the end, my curiosity got the best of me. Very slowly, I unlatched the ammo box and raised the lid. It had a faint smell of oil from the rag that I had originally wrapped the mirror in. I took a deep breath and reached into the box, retrieving the rag. I fell to my knees, openly weeping and breathing heavily when I discovered that the rag was empty. I shook it out in disbelief, dropping it and the ammo can. What kind of evil did I expose myself and my family to? I was too weak to stand for several minutes. I chunked the can and the rag onto a shelf in the shed. I climbed onto the tractor, wiping my eyes, and loaded the firewood into the front end loader. Once I had completed this task, I retreated to my man cave and poured myself a drink. The peace had once again eluded me. Does it know that I'm actively trying to suppress it? I thought to myself. What held the mirror in its muddy grave at the bridge? Had someone discarded it for the same reason as I? Did they see the girl as well? If I return it to its resting place, will I be free of it? Is the spirit trying to reach out for help? I was driving myself crazy with all the thoughts that were flooding my consciousness. If I find it yet again and try to communicate with this thing, it would most likely only get worse. Each question that I asked myself only led to more questions. I had a fleeting thought of one way I was sure I could get rid of this evil artifact. My wife works at a local antique shop a couple of days a week. We could sell it there, if it would stay in place long enough to sell. But I eventually dismissed the thought and drove it from my mind, not wanting to bring this evil upon some innocent soul. It's been 6 long months now since I discovered the piece was missing, and there isn't a day that passes where I don't ponder and dread the thought of finding it again in some obscure place on my property. I have decided that if and when that day arrives, I'll be making another trip to Crybaby Bridge.